March 14, 1944, Baltimore, Maryland, 1247 Calvert Street. A middle-aged woman freezes in the hallway of the boarding house, staring at the mirror she'd positioned yesterday at an unusual angle. In the reflection, she sees what she wasn't supposed to see. An elderly man in a worn suit carefully opens someone else's handbag hanging on the coat rack. His fingers, long, precise, mathematically calculated, slide inside and extract a wallet. He counts out exactly $2.50, not more, not less. Returns the wallet to its place. Closes the bag with the same care one might close a ledger after balancing accounts. The woman doesn't breathe. She finally understands where money has been disappearing for the past 3 years. Her name was Vivian Ruth Caldwell, 38 years old, bookkeeper at Hochschild Cone Department Store on Howard Street, divorced since 1939, had been living in this rooming house since early 1941. A 12-by-10 room on the second floor, window facing the alley where cats fought over garbage and children played stickball on summer evenings. Shared facilities with 9 other tenants, 2 bathrooms that were never quite clean enough, 1 kitchen where the icebox door didn't seal properly, a common hallway with wallpaper peeling in the corners. Standard wartime Baltimore housing for people who worked honest jobs but couldn't afford anything better. The building had been a single-family townhouse once, back before the Depression. 4 stories, narrow and deep, built in 1887 according to the date carved above the door. Now it was divided into 10 rooms, each with a different tenant, each paying between $18 and $25 a month depending on size and floor. The landlord, Mr. Gershon Weiss, lived in Pikesville and came by twice a month to collect rent and ignore complaints about the plumbing. Vivian had moved in on a cold February day in 1941, 3 months after her divorce was finalized. Her former husband, Robert Caldwell, had been a salesman for a pharmaceutical company. Charming, unreliable, fond of poker games and women who weren't his wife. The divorce had cost her most of her savings in legal fees, and she'd found herself at 35 needing to start over. The boarding house on Calvert Street wasn't what she'd imagined for her life, but it was clean enough, close to the streetcar line, and the other tenants mostly kept to themselves. The pensioner's name was Fletcher Josiah Bramwell. 62 years old, tall and thin in the way of men who forget to eat regular meals. Former mathematics teacher at Eastern High School, where he'd taught geometry and advanced algebra for 27 years, had resigned from teaching in early 1942 under circumstances nobody discussed openly. There were rumors, whispers, something about the West Coast and the camps, but nothing concrete that anyone would say out loud in polite company. He lived alone in the smallest room on the first floor, at the very end of the corridor past the back stairs. 8 feet by 9 feet. Barely large enough for a single bed, a desk, a wooden chair, and a narrow wardrobe. The room had been a servant's quarters in the old days, back when families who lived in houses like this had servants. Now it was the cheapest room in the building, $18 a month, no window except a small transom that looked into the hallway, always dim even in the middle of the day. Fletcher kept his door closed always. When he emerged, it was only for necessities. The corner grocery for bread and milk, the newsstand on Monument Street for the Sun papers, occasionally the public library on Cathedral Street. He greeted the other tenants politely but briefly. A nod. __quote _0 __. Nothing more. Never lingered in the hallway for conversation. Never joined the others in the kitchen during evening hours when people gathered to cook and complain about rationing and the war news. The other tenants had opinions about him. Mrs. Margaret Kowalski, the seamstress in room 4, thought he was shell-shocked from the First War, though Fletcher would have been too young for that. Mr. Walter Harrison, the welder who worked at the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Sparrows Point, figured Fletcher was just antisocial, the kind of man who'd never learned how to talk to regular people. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, whose husband was serving in the Pacific, thought Fletcher was simply lonely and sad, though she couldn't say why she thought so. Only Vivian wondered if there was something more deliberate about his isolation. She'd been watching him carefully for 2 months now, ever since she'd started keeping her notebook. Vivian slowly backed into her room and shut the door. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anger mixed with something like vindication. She'd been right. All those small disappearances, all those moments when she'd thought she was going mad or becoming forgetful, all those times she'd counted her money twice and come up short. She'd been right to be suspicious. She pulled out the notebook from under her mattress, a plain composition book with a marbled black and white cover, the kind school children used. Inside, her neat bookkeeper's handwriting filled the pages. Dates, amounts, names. A careful record of money that had vanished. After the third time in a year the change disappeared from her purse, sometimes $3, sometimes $2, sometimes $5, she'd started asking questions. Carefully, casually. She'd mentioned it to Mrs. Kowalski one evening while they were both doing dishes in the kitchen. You ever notice money going missing? Just small amounts? Mrs. Kowalski had paused, hands in the soapy water. Funny you should mention it. I thought I was going senile. Lost $4 last month. Couldn't figure out where. When? Let me think. Tuesday the 14th. I'd just gotten paid, had the money in my handbag on the coat rack. Went to make supper, came back an hour later and $4 were gone. Thought maybe I'd miscounted at the shop. Vivian had written it down that night. Then she'd asked the others, one by one, over the course of several weeks. Always casual. Always careful not to sound accusatory. Mr. Walter Harrison, quote, 5. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, quote, 6. Mr. Arnold Fishman, the accountant in room 8, quote, 7. One by one, the stories accumulated. Small amounts. Always from the hallway, from coat pockets, from handbags on the rack, from jackets hung up while people were in their rooms or in the kitchen. Never enough to make a real fuss about. Never enough to call the police over. But Vivian was a bookkeeper. She knew how to see patterns where others saw random noise. She added up the numbers, cross-referenced the dates, looked for correlations. Over 3 years, from early 1941 to March 1944, at least $240 had vanished from this boarding house. In small increments, $2 to $4 at a time, from different tenants, different locations in the hallway, but always following the same pattern. When people were home but not in the corridor. When the hallway was empty but the building wasn't. When someone could move quickly and quietly without being seen. The amounts were too consistent to be coincidence, too carefully calibrated, never enough to trigger a real investigation, never so frequent that the pattern was obvious, mathematically precise. 2 months ago, Vivian had installed the mirror. She'd bought it at a second-hand shop on Eastern Avenue, a simple rectangular mirror in a wooden frame, nothing fancy. She'd told the other tenants it was because the hallway was so dark she wanted to be able to see around the corner before stepping out of her room. A reasonable explanation. Nobody questioned it, but she'd positioned it at a very specific angle. Not straight ahead, tilted slightly downward and to the left, so that from her doorway, if she opened the door just a crack, she could see the reflection of the coat rack at the end of the hall. The coat rack where everyone hung their jackets and bags when they came home. She'd watched for 6 weeks. Most days, nothing. Just the usual comings and goings. People arriving home from work, hanging up their coats, going to their rooms. But 3 times she'd seen Fletcher Bramwell emerge from his room at the end of the hall. Move to the coat rack. Check quickly to make sure the hallway was empty. Then, carefully, methodically, open a bag or reach into a coat pocket. Extract a wallet. Remove a small amount of money. Return everything exactly as it was, and retreat to his room. 3 times in 6 weeks, always mid-afternoon or early evening, always when people were home but occupied, cooking dinner, listening to the radio, washing up. And now, today, she'd watched him take $2.50 from Mrs. Kowalski's handbag. Vivian opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote in her careful script, ___quote, _8___. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow she would go to the police. The next morning, March 15th, Vivian took the streetcar downtown to the Central District Police Station on East Fayette Street. It was a Wednesday, gray and drizzling, the kind of March weather that made Baltimore feel older and grimmer than it was. The station was a stolid brick building that smelled of cigarette smoke, floor wax, and the particular institutional odor of places where many people pass through but nobody really lived. Vivian approached the front desk where a middle-aged sergeant with an Irish name, O'Malley, according to the nameplate, sat reading the morning paper. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked without looking up. "I'd like to report a theft." Now he looked up, took in her respectable coat, her neat hair, her bookkeeper's posture. O'Malley set down his paper. "That's a lot of money. When did this happen?" "It's been happening since early 1941. Systematically, at the boarding house where I live." "And you're just reporting it now?" "I needed to be certain. I needed evidence." O'Malley pulled out an incident form and a pencil. O'Malley wrote this down. "And how do you know he stole it?" "I observed him 3 times over the past 6 weeks. I positioned a mirror in the hallway that allowed me to see the area where tenants hang their coats and bags. I watched him take money from different people's belongings." "In a mirror?" O'Malley's tone was skeptical. "In a mirror, yes. He didn't know I could see him. The angle was such that I had a clear view while remaining in my room." "Ma'am, you want us to arrest someone because you saw him in a mirror?" Vivian reached into her handbag and pulled out her notebook, set it on the desk with a solid thump. "I want you to investigate based on documented evidence. I've kept records, dates, amounts, witnesses. I've interviewed every tenant in the building. All of them have had money go missing over the past 3 years. Small amounts, $2 to $5 at a time. Always from the hallway. Always when they were home but not watching their belongings. I have 47 separate incidents documented here, with dates and amounts." O'Malley opened the notebook, leafed through several pages. His expression changed from skeptical to interested. Quote, 27, quote, 28, quote, 29, quote, 30. O'Malley continued reading. The notebook was impressively thorough. Each entry included date, victim's name, amount stolen, location in hallway, approximate time based on when the victim noticed the money missing. Cross-references between entries, running totals. He looked up at Vivian with new respect. Quote, 31, quote, 32, quote, 33, quote. He closed the notebook carefully. Quote, 34, quote. 20 minutes later, Vivian found herself in a small office with Sergeant O'Malley and Detective Morris Grantham. Grantham was a lean man in his 40s, wearing a brown suit that had seen better days. He had the sharp, tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much human nature at its worst. Grantham said, "Vivian did." She explained the pattern of small thefts, the interviews with other tenants, the decision to install the mirror, the 3 observations of Fletcher Bramwell taking money. She spoke calmly, precisely, like she was presenting a financial audit. Grantham listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Vivian said." Both men looked at her sharply. Grantham leaned back in his chair, studying her. Vivian said slowly. Grantham exchanged a look with O'Malley. Then he stood up. "All right, Mrs. Caldwell, give us 2 days to investigate. We'll interview the other tenants, confirm your information. If everything checks out, we'll pay Mr. Bramwell a visit." 3 days later, on the afternoon of March 18th, 1944, 2 detectives came to 1247 Calvert Street. Vivian watched from her second-floor window as they arrived in an unmarked police car. Detective Grantham and a younger detective she didn't recognize. They entered the building, and she heard their footsteps on the stairs, heavy, official footsteps that made the old boards creak. She opened her door a crack and listened. The knock on Fletcher Bramwell's door echoed in the hallway. A pause. Then the door opened. Fletcher Josiah Bramwell? That was Grantham's voice. Fletcher's voice was calm, measured, a teacher's voice, used to speaking clearly. Quote 53, quote 54, quote 55. A pause. Vivian counted. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then Fletcher's voice. May I get my coat? No surprise in his tone. No protest. No, there must be some mistake, or, I don't know what you're talking about. Just, may I get my coat? Yes, sir. Vivian heard movement, the rustle of fabric, footsteps. I'm ready. After you, Mr. Bramwell. They walked past her door. Vivian caught a glimpse through the crack. Fletcher in his worn gray overcoat, hat in hand, walking between the two detectives. His face was expressionless, not guilty, not innocent, just blank, like a page waiting for numbers to be written on it. After they left, the building buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Kowalski knocked on Vivian's door within minutes. Quote, 62, quote, 63, Vivian corrected. Quote, 64, quote, 65. Vivian hesitated. Then, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 66, underscore, underscore. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes widened. No, that quiet old man? Are you sure? The police are investigating. We'll know soon enough. At the Central District Station, Fletcher Bramwell sat in interview room 2, hands folded on the metal table, waiting patiently. The room was small, windowless, painted an institutional green that had faded to the color of old lettuce. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. The table was scarred with cigarette burns and carved initials. Fletcher sat perfectly still, his posture erect, his face calm. Grantham entered carrying Vivian's notebook. He sat down across from Fletcher and placed the notebook between them. Fletcher adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Grantham pushed the notebook across the table. Fletcher opened it, read slowly, turning pages with careful deliberation. His expression didn't change. After several minutes, he closed the notebook and pushed it back. Impressive work, he said. Methodical, almost entirely accurate. Almost? On February 19th, the entry states I took $3 from Mr. Harrison's coat pocket. I took $2.75. And on January 8th, the entry says I took $4 from Mrs. Chen. It was $3.50. Mrs. Caldwell's sources were apparently working from memory rather than immediate observation. Grantham felt a chill run down his spine. You're admitting you took the money? Yes. Just like that? You're confessing? You have evidence. You have a witness. Mrs. Caldwell apparently observed me directly on at least one occasion, or she wouldn't have been able to describe my methodology with such accuracy. You've clearly interviewed the other tenants and confirmed that money has been disappearing. There's no point in denial. Most people would still deny it. Most people aren't mathematicians. I deal in facts and logical deduction. The facts indicate that you have sufficient evidence for prosecution. Denial would be illogical. Grantham leaned back in his chair, studying this strange man who spoke about theft the way other people discuss the weather. Why did you do it? Fletcher considered the question. May I explain with some precision? Please. My pension from the Baltimore City public school system is $41 per month. This amount was determined in 1942 when I left teaching. From that $41, I must pay $18 for room rent at the boarding house, approximately $7 for food, bread, milk, occasional eggs and cheese, $2.75 for gas and electric, $1 for coal in winter, approximately $3 for miscellaneous necessities, soap, razor blades, shoe repairs, postage. That totals approximately $31.75 per month, leaving me with $9.25. He paused, as if waiting for Grantham to follow the mathematics. $9 a month, Grantham said, for everything else. Precisely. $9 for newspapers, which I consider essential. For books from the secondhand shops which keep me sane. For occasional coffee at the diner. For new socks when the old ones wear through. For medicine when I'm ill. For unexpected expenses that inevitably arise. $9 is insufficient for a dignified existence. You could have applied for relief. I did. In June 1942, I was awarded an additional $3 per month, bringing my total to $44. That still left me with approximately $12 for discretionary expenses. Still insufficient. You could have found work. I'm 62 years old with a damaged reputation. Former teachers who've been asked to resign don't find employment easily, particularly during a war when younger men are needed for essential work. So you decided to steal. I decided to supplement my income through resource reallocation. Resource reallocation, Grantham repeated. That's what you call stealing from your neighbors? I call it what it is mathematically. Taking small amounts from those who have sufficient to meet their needs and redistributing it to myself, who does not. I calculated the optimal amount to take from each person, enough to make a difference to me, but not enough that they would suffer real hardship or take serious action to investigate. How much did you take total? Fletcher paused to calculate. His lips moved slightly as he did mental arithmetic. $237.60. Over 3 years and 2 months. January 1941 through March 1944. How do you remember the exact amount? I keep records. Grantham sat forward. Where? In my room. In the closet. Top shelf behind a stack of old mathematics textbooks. A notebook with a brown cover. Why the hell would you keep written records of crimes you committed? For the first time, something like expression crossed Fletcher's face. Not quite a smile. More like the look a teacher gives when a student asks the question the teacher was hoping for. Fletcher said, 20 minutes later, Detective Willis returned from 1247 Calvert Street, carrying a thin notebook with a brown paper cover. Grantham opened it on the table between himself and Fletcher. The first page bore a title in neat handwriting. Quote, 108. Inside, a table. Columns labeled date, source, amount, running total, balance after expenses, notes. The entries were meticulous. Every theft documented with scientific precision. January 14th, 1941. Source, M.K. Margaret Kowalski. Amount, $2.50. Running total, $2.50. Balance after expenses, $11.20. Notes. First successful operation. Subject returned home at 6:15 p.m., went directly to kitchen. Handbag left on coat rack. Optimal window, 6:20 to 6:40 p.m. January 28, 1941. Source, W.H. Walter Harrison. Amount, $3. Running total, $5.50. Balance after expenses, $13.80. Notes. Subject removes coat immediately upon returning from work, hangs on rack, goes to room to change. Window, 15 to 20 minutes. February 11th, 1941. Source, V.C. Vivian Caldwell. Amount, $2. Running total, $7.50. Balance after expenses, $14.90. Notes. Subject very methodical about belongings. Purse always in same position. Recommend maximum frequency, once per 6 weeks to avoid detection. The entries continued, page after page. Each theft documented. Each source identified by initials. Each amount recorded. Each success noted with the dispassionate language of a scientific experiment. But it was the notes in the margins that made Grantham's blood run cold. Notes about the tenant's schedules. __, quote _109 __. Notes about routines. __, quote _110 __. Notes about optimal amounts. Underscore underscore quote underscore 111 underscore underscore. Notes about frequency. Underscore underscore quote underscore 112 underscore underscore. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was a system. A carefully designed, rigorously tested, continuously refined system. Fletcher Bramwell had turned his neighbors into variables in an equation and solved for maximum theft with minimum detection. Grantham looked up from the notebook. You really did treat this like an experiment. It was an experiment. I stated a hypothesis that I could systematically supplement my income through small thefts without detection, provided I maintained proper operational discipline and calculated probabilities correctly. I tested that hypothesis over a period of 3 years and 2 months. The hypothesis was largely confirmed. I successfully acquired $237.60 before detection occurred. You got caught. That means the experiment failed. No. The experiment succeeded for 3 years. Detection occurred due to a variable I failed to account for, Mrs. Caldwell's installation of a mirror at an unconventional angle. That represents a failure in my observational protocol, not a failure of the underlying hypothesis. Grantham felt like he was talking to someone from another planet. Mr. Bramwell, you understand you've committed a crime? Multiple crimes? Of course. Article 27, Section 342 of the Maryland Criminal Code. Theft. A misdemeanor if the total value is under $50, a felony if over. Since the total exceeds $200, this would be prosecuted as felony theft. Potential sentence? Up to 5 years imprisonment, though first-time offenders typically receive reduced sentences. I estimated my probability of conviction, if caught, at approximately 95% given the systematic nature of the offenses. I estimated probability of imprisonment, if convicted, at approximately 60%. Expected sentence, 18 to 24 months. You calculated the probability of going to prison? Of course, that was part of the experiment design. I needed to determine whether the potential risk was worth the actual benefit. And was it worth it? Fletcher was silent for a moment. Then, that depends on how one measures worth. Financially? Yes. $237 over 3 years significantly improved my quality of life. I was able to purchase books, newspapers, decent coffee, warm socks, medicine when needed. Psychologically? That's more complex. Psychologically? The experiment wasn't only about money, Detective. It was about testing a hypothesis concerning my own nature. What kind of hypothesis? Fletcher removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, replaced them. A gesture Grantham sensed he made when he was buying time to choose his words carefully. Before I answer that, Fletcher said, I should tell you something about my employment history. You mentioned I left teaching in 1942. That's accurate, but incomplete. I didn't simply leave. I was asked to resign. Do you know why? No. I worked as a civilian guard at the Manzanar War Relocation Center from December 1940 to November 1941. Do you know what that is? Grantham nodded slowly. Everyone knew about the camps, even if people didn't like to talk about them. Japanese Americans, citizens, locked up without trial for the duration of the war. Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt in February 1942, though some facilities had been established earlier, Grantham said. Fletcher's voice remained calm, but his hands on the table had tightened into fists. I was told to make the existing resources last until the next supply shipment arrived in 2 weeks. I approached this as a mathematics problem. I calculated optimal distribution of available blankets and medical supplies based on demographic factors, age, existing health status, probability of survival. I created a rationing system that prioritized resources for those most likely to survive with treatment. Grantham felt his stomach tighten. You decided who got blankets and who didn't. I created an algorithm. The algorithm decided. I simply implemented it. And? 3 elderly internees in my section died of pneumonia during that cold period. Kenji Tanaka, age 71. Yuki Nakamura, age 68. Haruto Yamamoto, age 74. An internal investigation determined that my rationing system had contributed to their deaths by denying them adequate blankets and medical care during critical hours. I was immediately terminated. The War Department chose not to file criminal charges. Wartime operational protocols, resource constraints, bureaucratic complications. I returned to Baltimore in December 1941. In February 1942, the school board learned about the circumstances of my departure from Manzanar. They suggested I resign from my teaching position. I did. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light. "You killed 3 people," Grantham said quietly. "I created a system that prioritized efficiency over individual human life. That system resulted in 3 deaths. Legally, I was never charged. Morally?" Fletcher looked directly at Grantham. "Morally, I'm responsible for those deaths." "And the thefts? How does that connect?" When I returned to Baltimore and found myself living on an inadequate pension, I confronted a question. Was I still the same person who had created that system at Manzanar? Was I still capable of treating other human beings as variables in an equation? Of prioritizing my own needs over their dignity and autonomy? Grantham began to understand. The thefts were a test. Yes, an experiment to determine whether I retained the capacity for systematic dehumanization, whether I could construct another system, smaller scale, lower stakes, but fundamentally similar, in which I treated my neighbors as resources to be optimized, rather than as people deserving respect. And what did you learn? That I am indeed still that person. For 3 years, I methodically stole from people who trusted me, people who lived in the same building, people who greeted me every day. I calculated probabilities. I optimized amounts and frequencies. I treated them as data points. I felt no guilt during the operations themselves, only the satisfaction of a well-executed plan. I am precisely the same person who created the system that killed Kenji Tanaka, Yuki Nakamura, and Haruto Yamamoto. Fletcher looked down at his hands. The experiment was successful. I proved my hypothesis. I am beyond redemption. Grantham sat back in his chair, feeling like he needed a drink. "Mr. Bramwell, I've been a cop for 18 years. I've interviewed murderers, rapists, armed robbers. You're the first person I've met who committed crimes specifically to prove to himself that he's a bad person." "Not a bad person, Detective. A person capable of systematic dehumanization under the right circumstances. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. A bad person acts from malice or impulse. I acted from design, from intellectual curiosity about my own nature, which is arguably worse." They sat in silence for several moments. Finally, Grantham said, "We're going to have to charge you." "I understand. $237 over 3 years. Felony theft. You'll go to trial." "I expect so. You could get prison time. 18 to 24 months, according to my calculations. I'm prepared for that." Grantham shook his head slowly. "Mr. Bramwell, most criminals try to minimize their guilt. You're sitting here proving yours." "Because it's true, Detective. And because the experiment is complete, I have my answer. Now I face the consequences." Fletcher Bramwell was released on his own recognizance that evening. The prosecutor's office filed charges 3 days later. Felony theft, systematic pattern, multiple victims. Trial was set for late April. At the boarding house, the atmosphere was strange. Everyone now knew that Fletcher had been stealing from them for 3 years. Mrs. Kowalski wanted him evicted immediately. Mr. Harrison wanted to confront him, though his wife talked him out of it. Mrs. Chen, surprisingly, felt something like pity. Vivian felt none of these things. She felt vindicated, yes. She'd been right. Her system had worked. Her careful observations had solved the puzzle. But she also felt disturbed by what had emerged during the police investigation. Detective Grantham had told her about Fletcher's confession, about Manzanar, about the 3 deaths and the rationing system. She'd thought she'd caught a petty thief. She'd actually caught something much more unsettling. A man conducting a psychological experiment on himself using his neighbors as subjects. Fletcher remained in his room for the most part. The few times Vivian saw him in the hallway, he nodded politely, said good morning or good evening in that same calm voice, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just confessed to 3 years of systematic theft and responsibility for 3 deaths. One evening, about a week before the trial, Vivian met him in the hallway near the kitchen. She'd been avoiding this moment, but now it had come. "Mr. Bramwell," she said. He stopped. "Mrs. Caldwell. I need to ask you something." "Of course. Did you know I was watching you? With the mirror?" Fletcher thought about this. "Not initially, but I did notice the mirror appeared about 6 weeks ago. I calculated the angle and realized it provided a view of the coat rack area. I estimated probability that this was deliberate surveillance at approximately 40%. I chose to continue operations anyway." "Why?" "Because," Fletcher said slowly, "by that point, I had already proven my hypothesis. I'd been successfully stealing for nearly 3 years. Whether I was caught or not was irrelevant to the experimental question. And perhaps," he paused, "perhaps part of me wanted to be caught, to force the conclusion of the experiment." "Did you want to go to prison?" "I don't want it, but I accept it. It's a logical consequence of my actions. And perhaps," another pause, "perhaps it's appropriate. I was never punished for what happened at Manzanar. Perhaps this is a form of compensation, even if the legal charges are unrelated." Vivian looked at him carefully. "Mr. Bramwell, do you feel guilty about any of this?" "Guilt is an emotion. I experience it intellectually, but not viscerally. I understand that what I did was wrong, both at Manzanar and here. I understand it violated ethical principles and caused harm. But do I feel it the way most people do? No. That's part of the problem. That's part of what the experiment confirmed. That you're incapable of normal human emotion? That I'm capable of overriding human emotion with systematic thinking. When I created the rationing system at Manzanar, I knew intellectually that I was potentially condemning people to death. But in the moment of creating the system, all I felt was the satisfaction of solving a complex optimization problem. The deaths were abstract, numbers in an equation. And the thefts? The same. Intellectually, I knew I was violating trust, taking what wasn't mine, causing anxiety and suspicion among people who'd done me no harm. But in the moment of execution, all I felt was the satisfaction of a well-executed plan. You're describing yourself like you're a machine. No, machines don't have the capacity for self-awareness. I'm a human being who's learned that I can choose to function like a machine when it serves my purposes. That's what the experiment was testing. Whether that capacity still existed after Manzanar. It does. Vivian felt a chill. And now? Now I'll stand trial, likely be convicted, likely serve 12 to 18 months in prison. While there, I'll have time to consider whether the data I've collected has any implications for my future behavior. Though I suspect it doesn't. People don't change their fundamental nature. They simply learn to manage it. He nodded politely and continued down the hallway to his room. Vivian stood there for a long time after he'd gone, thinking about what it meant that a man could discuss his own moral failures with the detachment of a scientist discussing lab results. The trial began on April 24, 1944. The courtroom in the Baltimore City Circuit Court was half empty. Wartime Baltimore had bigger concerns than an elderly man stealing pocket change from his neighbors. But the case drew some interest because of the unusual circumstances. The systematic nature of the thefts, the detailed record-keeping, and the strange confession involving Manzanar. The prosecutor was Donald Mercer, 32 years old, eager and competent, waiting for his draft notice and hoping to establish a solid record before he left for the service. He saw the case as straightforward. Confession, documentary evidence, multiple witnesses. Open and shut. The public defender was Lawrence Finch, 58 years old, overworked and underpaid, handling 6 cases simultaneously. He met with Fletcher for 30 minutes before the trial, Fletcher said. Finch rubbed his temples. The trial itself lasted 2 days. The prosecution presented Vivian's testimony about her observations and her documentary evidence. Presented testimony from the other tenants about money that had disappeared. Presented Fletcher's own notebook with its meticulous records. When Mercer finished presenting the theft evidence, he paused. Then he said to the judge, quote, 196, quote, 197. Judge Harold Steinberg said, Mercer called Fletcher to the stand. Fletcher was sworn in, sat calmly, hands folded. Fletcher explained, in the same calm voice he'd used with Detective Grantham, about Manzanar, the rationing system, the 3 deaths. The courtroom went completely silent. Let me make sure I understand, Mercer said. You created a system that resulted in 3 deaths at an internment camp. That's correct. And you faced no criminal charges for this? The War Department conducted an internal investigation and determined that while my system was poorly designed, it didn't constitute criminal negligence given the resource constraints in wartime operational conditions. I was terminated from my position, but no charges were filed. And how do you feel about those 3 deaths? Fletcher was silent for a moment. I understand intellectually that my actions contributed to those deaths. I understand this represents a serious moral failure. But if you're asking whether I experience emotional remorse in the way most people do, the answer is no. The courtroom erupted. Judge Steinberg banged his gavel. Mr. Bramwell, Mercer continued, how does what happened at Manzanar relate to the thefts from your neighbors? After I returned from Manzanar, I wanted to determine whether I was still capable of the same type of systematic thinking that had resulted in those deaths. Whether I could still treat other human beings as variables in an equation rather than as people deserving dignity and consideration. The thefts were an experiment to test that capacity. An experiment? Yes, a controlled test with a clear hypothesis that I could systematically take from others for my own benefit without experiencing appropriate moral restraint. The experiment confirmed the hypothesis. You're saying you stole from your neighbors to prove to yourself that you're a bad person? I stole from my neighbors to prove that I retain the capacity for systematic dehumanization, which I do. Mercer looked at the jury. No further questions. The defense had little to offer. Finch briefly questioned Fletcher about his financial situation, his lack of family, the inadequacy of his pension. But Fletcher wouldn't cooperate with any attempt to paint him as a sympathetic figure. Finch gave up quickly. In closing arguments, Mercer was blunt. Quote, 224 Finch, in his closing, tried to emphasize the small amounts involved, the lack of violence, Fletcher's age and circumstances. But his heart wasn't in it, and the jury could tell. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing was held on May 3, 1944. Fletcher stood before Judge Steinberg. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Word had spread about the strange case of the mathematics teacher who'd run an experiment on himself. Mr. Bramwell, Judge Steinberg said, I've reviewed your case carefully. The thefts themselves would normally merit perhaps 12 months. But the systematic nature of your crimes, the detailed planning, and frankly, your disturbing lack of remorse lead me to a different conclusion. I'm sentencing you to 18 months in the Maryland House of Correction. You'll be eligible for parole after 12 months with good behavior. I'm also ordering you to make full restitution of $237.60 to the victims. Fletcher nodded. I understand, Your Honor. Do you have anything to say before I finalize this sentence? Fletcher stood. Yes, Your Honor. I want to make something clear for the record. This sentence is for the thefts. The other matter, the deaths at Manzanar, cannot be addressed by any court because no charges were filed and the statute of limitations, if any applied, has passed. But I want to state clearly, those three people, Kenji Tanaka, Yuki Nakamura, Haruto Yamamoto, died because I treated them as variables in a calculation, rather than as human beings deserving care. That was wrong. It cannot be compensated for or corrected. It can only be acknowledged. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Bramwell, in 23 years on the bench, I've never heard anyone speak quite like you do. I can't tell if you're being extraordinarily honest or extraordinarily disturbed. Perhaps both, Your Honor. Do you feel any remorse at all? I understand intellectually that I should. I understand that my actions caused harm. I understand that normal human beings would experience guilt and regret. But no, I don't feel those emotions in any meaningful way. That's part of what the experiment confirmed. Judge Steinberg shook his head slowly. 18 months. Bailiff, remand the prisoner. Maryland House of Correction, Jessup, Maryland, June 1944. The prison was overcrowded with wartime criminals, black marketeers who'd violated rationing regulations, draft dodgers, a few German sympathizers, the usual assortment of thieves and con men. Fletcher Bramwell, prisoner 4429, was assigned to cell block D, cell 17. The cell was 6 by 8 feet, with a narrow cot, a small desk bolted to the wall, and a toilet in the corner. One small window high up near the ceiling, showing a rectangle of sky that changed from gray to blue to black depending on the time of day. Fletcher found it oddly peaceful. No neighbors to avoid, no hallways to navigate. Just a small, contained space where the rules were clear and the routine was predictable. He worked in the prison laundry, operating one of the large industrial washing machines. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, in a hot, steamy room that smelled of soap and bleach. Mindless work, which he appreciated. It left his mind free to think. He read everything in the prison library, a modest collection of donated books, mostly pulp westerns and outdated encyclopedias, but also some mathematics texts and a few classics. He reread Euclid's Elements, finding comfort in the clean logic of geometric proofs. He kept to himself, didn't join any of the prison's social groups, didn't make friends, responded politely when other prisoners spoke to him, but never initiated conversation. 2 months into his sentence, in early August, he was summoned to the office of Eugene Bartlett, the civilian education coordinator. Bartlett was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, a former teacher himself, who'd spent the last decade trying to provide basic education to men who'd never had proper schooling. Bramwell, Bartlett said, I've been reviewing your file. You were a mathematics teacher for 27 years. That's correct. We have men here who can barely read, can't do basic arithmetic. When they get out, they're essentially unemployable. They can't calculate wages, can't make change, can't measure materials for any kind of skilled work. I run a basic education program, reading, writing, arithmetic. I could use someone with your background. You interested in teaching? Fletcher considered this. Mr. Bartlett, I assume you've read my entire file. You know why I lost my teaching position. You know about Manzanar. I know. And you know why I'm here now. The systematic theft, the experiment. I know that too. Then why would you trust me with teaching responsibilities? Bartlett leaned back in his chair. Because I've thought about it, and I've concluded that maybe the best thing for everyone, you included, is for you to do what you're actually good at. You hurt people by treating them like objects, like numbers in a system. Maybe you can help people by teaching them how numbers actually work. Maybe you can demonstrate to yourself that you're capable of treating people like people when you're in a teaching role. Or, Fletcher said, I might simply see the students as another system to optimize. That's a risk, But I've got 8 men who need to learn basic math, and you're qualified to teach them. If you're willing to try, I'm willing to give you the chance. If you abuse it, we stop immediately. But if you do it honestly, maybe it helps them. And maybe it helps you figure out whether you're as irredeemable as you think you are." Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then, "That's not how redemption works, Mr. Bartlett. Teaching arithmetic to prisoners doesn't erase what I did at Manzanar or to my neighbors." "No, it doesn't. But it's still better than doing nothing. What do you say?" "I'll do it." The classes started that week. 8 students, ranging in age from 19 to 47, all with minimal formal education. Fletcher taught them in a classroom that had once been a storage room: 12 desks, a chalkboard, a box of chalk, and a collection of worn mathematics textbooks donated by some civic organization. He taught basic arithmetic first: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Not with abstract examples, but with practical applications. Calculating wages, making change, measuring materials. "If you work 9 hours at $1.10 an hour," he would write on the board, "how much did you earn?" The students, men with calloused hands and prison tattoos, men who'd spent their lives being told they were stupid, would work through the problem. Fletcher would guide them patiently, never mocking, never dismissive, just clear, methodical explanation. One of the students was Dale Pritchard, 23 years old, in for burglary. Grew up in rural Appalachia, dropped out of school at 12 to work on his family's failing farm. Could barely read, had never progressed beyond counting on his fingers. After the 3rd class, Dale stayed behind. "Mr. Bramwell, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why you in here? You don't seem like you belong in a place like this." Fletcher set down the chalk he'd been organizing. Quote 256. Quote 257. Quote 258. Dale sat down heavily in one of the desks. Quote 259, 260, 261, 262, 263, 264. Dale shook his head slowly. 265, 266, 267. Fletcher thought about Eugene Bartlett's words, about systems and people, about numbers and humanity, because Mr. Bartlett suggested that perhaps I could use my skills to help rather than harm. Whether that constitutes any form of compensation for my wrongs, I don't know, but it's something I can do, so I'm doing it. You think it makes up for what you did? No, nothing can make up for what I did. But doing nothing would be worse than doing something. That's as close as I can come to an ethical framework at this point. Dale studied him. "You're a weird dude, Mr. Bramwell, but you explain math real clear, better than any teacher I ever had back home. So I guess I appreciate it." "You're welcome." Fletcher taught mathematics to prisoners for the next 12 months. As the original 8 students progressed, new students joined the program. By December 1944, he was teaching 2 classes, a basic arithmetic class and an intermediate class covering fractions, percentages, and basic algebra. He was a good teacher, patient, clear, never condescending. He explained concepts multiple ways until students understood. He created practical problems drawn from real life, calculating board feet for carpentry, figuring profit margins for small businesses, understanding interest rates. The students respected him, though they also found him strange. He never talked about himself unless directly asked, never engaged in the usual prison small talk, just taught mathematics with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to theft. In November 1944, Fletcher received a letter. It was forwarded from the boarding house, eventually finding its way to the prison. No return address. He opened it in his cell. The handwriting was familiar, neat, careful, a bookkeeper's handwriting. "Mr. Bramwell, I heard from Detective Grantham that you're teaching mathematics classes in prison. He mentioned you're doing this work without complaint and with apparent competence. I've thought about everything that happened, and I've decided to write to you. Not to forgive you. I don't have that right, particularly regarding what happened at Manzanar. Those 3 people who died, they were someone's father, someone's husband, someone's friend. I can't forgive you on their behalf. And I won't forgive you for stealing from me and my neighbors. But I want you to know, I saw your experiment. You proved to yourself what you're capable of when you treat people as objects. Perhaps now, in teaching these men, you're discovering what you're capable of when you treat them as people worth teaching. I don't know if that matters in any cosmic sense. I don't know if it balances any ledger. But someone should acknowledge that you're making the effort. Vivian Caldwell. Fletcher read the letter 3 times. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his small footlocker, along with his few other possessions. The next day in class, one of the newer students, a man named Raymond who was serving time for assault, asked a question Fletcher had been half expecting. "Mr. Bramwell, I heard you killed some people. That true?" The classroom went silent. 8 men looked at their teacher. Fletcher set down his chalk. "I created a system that resulted in 3 deaths. I wasn't charged criminally, but I was morally responsible." "And then you stole from your neighbors to prove you were still a bad person?" "To prove I was still capable of systematic dehumanization. Yes." "That's messed up." "Yes." "So, what are you now? Still a bad person?" Fletcher thought about Vivian's letter, about Eugene Bartlett's theory, about the past 6 months of teaching men who'd been told their whole lives they were too stupid to learn. Raymond nodded slowly. Fletcher picked up his chalk. Fletcher was released on January 7, 1946. 14 months served, 4 months off for good behavior. He walked out of the Maryland House of Correction into a different world. The war was over. Germany had surrendered in May 1945. Japan in August. Soldiers were coming home. The newspapers were full of stories about the post-war future, the United Nations, the atomic bomb, the beginning of what people were already calling the Cold War. Fletcher had $212 in his prison account, his wages from the laundry work, plus the money that had been in his possession when he was incarcerated. He also had the clothes he'd been arrested in, now cleaned and pressed, and a cardboard box containing his few possessions, the letter from Vivian, his glasses, a few books. He took the train back to Baltimore. The city looked the same, but felt different. More cars on the streets, more people. A sense of energy and possibility that hadn't been there during the war years. He didn't return to 1247 Calvert Street. His room had been rented months ago to a veteran just back from Europe. Instead, he found a small apartment in Highlandtown, in the Polish neighborhood on the east side. 2 rooms above a hardware store on Eastern Avenue. $23 a month. The landlord, a Polish immigrant named Mr. Kowalski, no relation to Margaret, didn't ask questions about Fletcher's past. Fletcher's pension had been reinstated while he was in prison. It was now $44 a month, slightly increased to account for inflation. He also needed work. At 64, with a prison record, options were limited. He found a job as a night watchman at Chesapeake Textiles, a warehouse near the harbor. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. $55 a month. Sit in a booth, check delivery trucks, walk the floors every hour to make sure nothing was amiss. No conversation required, no interaction with people, just solitude and routine. Total income, $99 a month. Rent, $23. Food, approximately $10. Utilities, $3. Miscellaneous, $5. That left $58 for everything else. More than enough. He settled into a new routine. Sleep during the day, work at night, read books from the library, keep to himself. But once a month, he made a trip. On the 2nd Saturday of each month, Fletcher took the train out to Jessup and visited the Maryland House of Correction. Not as a prisoner, as a visitor. He brought books for the library, mathematics textbooks he found at secondhand stores, notebooks and pencils, sometimes paper and chalk. He delivered these materials to Eugene Bartlett, who distributed them to the education program. Bartlett said after the third such visit, Fletcher looked at him. Bartlett nodded. Bartlett didn't argue. He knew Fletcher well enough by now to recognize when his mind was made up. The months passed. Winter became spring. 1946 became 1947. Fletcher maintained his routine. Work, sleep, read, monthly trips to the prison with books and supplies. He lived quietly, spoke to almost no one, existed on the margins of Baltimore life. His health was deteriorating. He'd developed a heart condition. The prison doctor had noted it during his last medical exam before release. The doctor had said. Fletcher ignored this advice. He continued working nights, sleeping irregularly, reading late into the evening before his shifts. In March 1947, on a cool evening with the smell of rain in the air, a woman appeared at the watchman's booth at Chesapeake Textiles. Fletcher looked up from the book he was reading, a collection of essays on game theory he'd found at a library sale. Vivian looked older. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, but she carried herself with the same precise, contained manner. "Mr. Bramwell, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. How did you find me?" "Through Mr. Bartlett at the prison. He mentioned you visit monthly with supplies. I asked if he knew where you were working." "I see. Would you like to sit?" There was a wooden bench against the wall of the booth. Vivian sat. Fletcher remained standing, maintaining professional distance. "I wanted to see what you'd become," Vivian said. "After prison. After everything." "And what have I become?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm here. You're teaching again, in a sense. Supporting education. Is that change, or just another system?" Fletcher considered this carefully. "That's an astute question, and I'm not certain I know the answer. I don't think I've fundamentally changed. I still have the capacity for systematic thinking that prioritizes efficiency over human dignity. I still don't experience guilt or remorse the way most people do. But perhaps I've learned to channel that capacity differently, to use systematic thinking for construction rather than exploitation." "Is that enough?" "Enough for what? For redemption? No. For legal rehabilitation? Yes, I've served my sentence and make restitution. For moral restoration? I don't believe such a thing is possible for me. But it's what I'm doing nonetheless." Vivian was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the dim light of the booth. "You know, Mr. Bramwell, most people would have learned to perform remorse by now. To say the right things, show the right emotions, convince others they've changed. I could do that. I understand intellectually what words and behaviors would be appropriate, but it would be performance, not truth. And I've decided that whatever else I am, I should at least be honest about what I am." "Which is what?" "A person capable of systematic dehumanization who has chosen, for complex reasons, to apply systematic thinking to slightly less harmful purposes. That's not redemption. It's not even really change. It's just redirection." Vivian pulled an envelope from her purse. "The tenants collected this. Everyone you stole from. We decided you should have it back." Fletcher looked at the envelope without touching it. "That's the restitution payment I made to the court." "Yes, $237.60. The court distributed it to us. We're returning it to you." "Why?" "Because you served your sentence. You paid your legal debt. And some of us thought that maybe you could use the money more than we can." Mrs. Kowalski disagreed. She thinks you should never see a penny of it. But Mr. Harrison convinced her. He said you'd proven you could be trusted by teaching in prison, so maybe we should trust you with this. Fletcher shook his head slowly. "I can't accept it." "Why not?" "Because I didn't earn that money honestly. It represents the proceeds of systematic exploitation. Taking it back would be accepting the fruit of my crimes." "You paid for those crimes. Legally, this money is yours." "Legally, perhaps. Morally, no. I violated trust. I exploited vulnerability. I treated my neighbors as resources. That can't be undone by serving time. Vivian set the envelope on the bench. Then use it for the prison education program, for books and supplies. Let it serve some constructive purpose. Fletcher looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he picked it up. All right, I'll deliver it to Mr. Bartlett next time I visit. It will fund the education program for at least a year. Good. Vivian stood to leave. Then she paused. Mr. Bramwell, I need to tell you something. I still haven't forgiven you. I don't know if I ever will. What you did, both at Manzanar and in our building, that was wrong. It hurt people. It violated fundamental principles of human dignity. I know. But I also see that you're trying to do something different now. And I think that matters. Not because it erases what came before, but because it demonstrates that people are capable of choosing different actions, even if they can't change their fundamental nature. Does that make sense? Yes, it makes sense. Then I'll leave you to your work. She walked out into the night. Fletcher stood in the booth, holding the envelope, thinking about systems and choices and the difference between redemption and redirection. Fletcher Bramwell died on June 12, 1947. Heart attack, massive and sudden. He was found slumped over his desk in the watchman's booth when the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. He was 65 years old, had been working as a night watchman for 17 months, had made 16 trips to the prison with books and supplies, had sent the restitution money to Eugene Bartlett 3 months earlier with a note explaining it should fund the education program. The police searched his apartment, found his few possessions, clothes, books, his teaching materials from Eastern High School, and 3 notebooks. The first notebook was the original from Calvert Street, the systematic record of 3 years of theft. The police returned it to evidence storage. The second notebook was from prison. Title on the cover, __quote _335 __. Inside, page after page of methodological notes, reflections on how different students learned, techniques for explaining mathematical concepts to people with no formal education, assessments of what worked and what didn't. The third notebook was newer, started after his release. Title, Compensation Attempt. Inside was a single entry, dated February 3, 1946. I have spent considerable time attempting to understand whether the concept of redemption has any meaningful application to my situation. I've concluded it does not. Redemption implies a return to a previous state of moral acceptability, but I was never in such a state. Even before Manzanar, I possessed the capacity for systematic dehumanization. Manzanar and the subsequent thefts simply manifested that capacity. What I can attempt instead is compensation. Not in the legal sense. I've paid my legal debt through imprisonment and restitution. But in a broader sense, using the time I have remaining to add some positive value to balance against the harm I've caused. This is not redemption. The 3 people who died at Manzanar cannot be brought back. The trust I violated cannot be fully restored. But I can teach mathematics to men who need education. I can provide resources for prison education programs. I can demonstrate that systematic thinking can be applied to construction as well as exploitation. Will this balance the equation? No. Some equations have no solution. But mathematics teaches that unsolvable equations still have meaning, not in their solutions, but in the rigorous process of working through them. Perhaps the same is true for moral equations. I will continue to work through this equation for as long as I have, not because I expect to solve it, but because the work itself is what I owe. The funeral was held on June 15th at a small chapel in Highlandtown. 4 people attended. Eugene Bartlett said, "He was a good teacher, helped a lot of men who'd never had proper education. The program still uses the materials he donated." Dale Pritchard, the former student who'd learned arithmetic in prison and was now working as a carpenter's apprentice, said, He taught me I wasn't stupid. First person who ever did that. Vivian Caldwell stood silent. She'd brought the mirror with her, not to the funeral, but she'd looked at it that morning before coming. The mirror that had caught Fletcher 3 years ago. The mirror that had started everything. After the service, she walked back to her house in Hampton. The mirror hung in her hallway where it had been since 1945. She looked at it, seeing her own reflection, and thought about angles and perspectives and the importance of seeing clearly. Epilogue. September 1951. Vivian sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a blank sheet of paper. She'd been thinking about Fletcher Bramwell for weeks now, ever since she'd received a letter from Eugene Bartlett. The letter had informed her that the prison education program was thriving. 23 men were currently enrolled in mathematics and basic literacy classes. The program had received additional funding from the state. And they just received a donation of books from an anonymous donor, someone who'd read about the program in a newspaper article and decided to contribute. "I thought you'd want to know," Bartlett had written, "that Fletcher's work is continuing to have effects. The men he taught have gone on to teach others. The materials he donated are still in use. His methodological notes have helped us improve the program. In a small way, he's still teaching." Vivian thought about this, about how actions continue to ripple outward even after the person who initiated them is gone. She picked up her pen and began to write. "Dear Editor, I want to tell you about a man named Fletcher Bramwell. He was a mathematics teacher, a person responsible for deaths, a systematic thief, and possibly a sociopath. But he was also a man who understood that while redemption might be impossible, compensation might not be. This isn't a story about forgiveness. I never forgave him, and I don't believe the families of those who died at Manzanar should be expected to either. This isn't a story about rehabilitation in the conventional sense. I don't think Fletcher changed his fundamental nature. This is a story about a man who proved to himself that he was capable of systematic dehumanization, and then spent his remaining time demonstrating that he was capable of systematic construction as well. Not as a balance, not as erasure, just as evidence that human beings contain multiple capacities, and we choose which ones to exercise. I caught him with a mirror positioned at the right angle. That mirror showed me a thief. But it also, eventually, showed me something more complex. A person grappling with his own nature in the only way he knew how, methodically, systematically, honestly. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if his teaching compensated for his crimes. I don't know if the men he helped would be better or worse off knowing the full extent of what he'd done. I only know that in 1944, I positioned a mirror at the right angle and saw a truth that needed seeing. And that sometimes, the most important thing isn't solving the problem. It's seeing it clearly. Vivian Caldwell, Baltimore, Maryland. She sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to the Atlantic Monthly in Boston, took it to the post office, mailed it. The letter was never published. The editor sent a polite rejection. While your story is compelling, we feel it raises more questions than it answers, and our readers generally prefer clearer moral frameworks. Vivian didn't mind. She hadn't written it for publication. She'd written it to create a record, to ensure that someone, somewhere, had documented what happened. The mirror stayed in Vivian's hallway for 20 more years. When she died in 1971 at age 65, her nephew inherited the house. He found the mirror, found her papers, found the whole strange story of Fletcher Bramwell and the systematic thefts. He kept the mirror, told his children about it. The story became family history. In 2006, Vivian's grandnephew donated the mirror and all associated documents to the Maryland Historical Society. They cataloged it. __quote_ 344 __. Researchers occasionally request access. Graduate students writing dissertations on wartime internment camps. Psychologists studying moral decision-making. Mathematicians interested in the ethics of systematic thinking. They read Fletcher's meticulous records, his calculations, his final notebook about compensation. They read Vivian's observations, her careful documentation, her refusal to forgive paired with her acknowledgement that effort matters. And they see the mirror. Plain, rectangular wooden frame. Just a mirror. But positioned at the right angle, it revealed everything. That's all it ever did. That's all Vivian ever asked it to do. And in March 1944, in a boarding house in Baltimore, that was enough.